My name is Lily Collins. I come from a quiet little town tucked between hills and rivers, a place where the air is always filled with the sounds of roosters crowing and children playing barefoot in the streets. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and where English was more like a stranger than a neighbor. You wouldn't find many people speaking it unless they were reading a textbook out loud or trying to pass an exam. But for me, from as early as I can remember, English wasn't just a subject, it was a dream. When I was around 6 or 7, my uncle returned from abroad. He had lived in the UK for several years and spoke English with a kind of charm that fascinated me. I remember watching him talk, even when I couldn't understand most of what he said. The rhythm, the smoothness, the expression, it all felt magical. He didn't sound like the voices in school books, he sounded alive, real, like someone from a different world. I would sit next to him every evening during his stay, listening to his conversations with my father. I didn't say a word. I just listened. That was my first silent step into the world of English. After he left, I started doing something strange. I began mimicking the sound of English. Not the words, just the sound. I would walk around the backyard, talking to myself in made-up English. It sounded silly, I know, but to me it was like singing a song in a language you don't speak. It felt good. I didn't understand the meaning, but I felt the music of it. My mother would laugh, telling me I sounded like a little radio, always on but never clear. School was different. In class, we were taught English like a formula. Subject, verb, object, tenses, rules, exceptions. It was all very tight and stiff. I followed the rules, answered the questions, and filled in the blanks. But every time I tried to speak, I felt like I was wearing someone else's shoes. Too big, too clumsy. I never felt at home in my sentences. They were correct, but cold. I could write an essay, but I couldn't order a cup of coffee in English, without sweating. Still, I kept dreaming. When I was 12, I started watching English cartoons, then movies, then interviews of actors, musicians, and travelers. I remember watching an interview of Emma Watson. The way she moved her hands, the pauses, the little laughs, the casual words. She wasn't just speaking. She was flowing. That's the word I kept thinking of. Flow. I didn't want to speak English. I wanted to flow in English. I started copying her in front of the mirror. I would say the same lines, try the same expressions, even mimic her tone. It wasn't about grammar. It was about rhythm, sound, feeling. When I spoke that way, I felt like a different person, a more confident, fearless version of me. But that confidence always broke the moment I stepped outside, and someone asked me a question in English. I would freeze. My words would break apart, like thin glass. I thought maybe if I studied more, I'd fix it. So I studied harder. More vocabulary, more phrases, more lists. But strangely, the more I studied, the less natural I sounded. I was chasing the language like it was running away from me. And maybe, in a way, it was, because I was chasing it in the wrong way. People around me started asking why I cared so much. "You live here," they said. "You don't need English to survive." And maybe they were right. I didn't need it, but I wanted it, not for a job, not for school, but for myself. To me, English wasn't just about communication. It was about connection. It was about standing in front of someone from a different part of the world and not feeling small. It was about walking into a bookstore in a new city and reading a book without flipping to the back for a translation. It was about feeling like I belonged in the global world, not as a tourist, but as a citizen. Still, the path wasn't clear. I started trying to sound like people in the movies. I practiced speaking in front of my phone camera, watching my expressions, listening to my voice. Sometimes I looked confident. Other times, I cringed. I hated how flat my voice sounded, how stiff, like a robot reading lines. I didn't feel natural at all. One day, while walking to school, I passed a tourist couple on the street. They were lost and looking around. I saw the woman point to a map and the man shake his head. I had this sudden urge to help. I walked over and asked, in English, "Can I help you?" They looked at me and smiled. "Oh, thank you. We're trying to find the train station." I gave them directions. It was a short conversation, less than 2 minutes. But when they thanked me and walked away, I stood there in the sun, heart pounding. My words hadn't felt perfect, but they had felt real, and the couple had understood me. They didn't laugh. They didn't look confused. They had listened. That moment stayed with me. I began to understand that speaking naturally wasn't about sounding like someone else. It was about sounding like yourself, but in another language. I still made mistakes. Sometimes I paused too long. Sometimes I used the wrong word. But people understood me. They listened. They responded. That was enough. In those years, I spent more time listening than speaking. Not in classrooms, but in real life. On YouTube, in movies, in music, in the way my favorite actors gave interviews. I stopped focusing on being perfect. I started focusing on being present. That small shift changed everything, and still, something felt missing. I felt like I was close, so close, to speaking naturally but not quite there, like I had the keys, but not the map. Then something happened. Something that would finally show me the answer I had been searching for. I still remember the first time I tried to hold a full conversation in English. It was with a tourist couple who had come to visit our local museum. I was volunteering there and they asked me where the restrooms were. Easy enough. I had rehearsed sentences like that many times. "The restrooms are on the left side of the hallway," I said, but I could feel the awkward pause in my own voice. I sounded like a robot. My tongue hesitated in the middle of hallway. The stress was wrong. My rhythm was strange. They looked at each other, smiled politely, and repeated, "Ah, left side. Okay, thank you." That small moment stayed with me. Not because I said something wrong, but because of how I said it. And from then on, I began to notice it happening everywhere. I had memorized hundreds of vocabulary words. I had filled notebooks with grammar rules. I could recite irregular verbs like poetry. In school, I always got good marks in English, but the real world was not impressed by my exams. I found myself standing quietly during group conversations, nodding like I understood, even when I didn't. And when I did speak, I felt like I had stepped into the wrong room at the wrong time. At parties or meetups, I would prepare answers in my head before someone asked a question. "What do you do? Where are you from? What do you like to read?" I would practice the answer silently, but when the moment came, I'd freeze. My mouth opened, my words came out, but they felt disconnected from me, like I had learned them from a script. People would wait a second before replying. They would tilt their heads and smile with understanding eyes, as if trying to reassure me. Or worse, they would repeat what I had just said, adding their own version. Sometimes they would correct me gently. "Oh, you mean you like reading novels, right?" And I would nod, embarrassed, even though I already knew what I meant to say. My grammar wasn't wrong. My words were fine. But something about how I said them made people unsure. That feeling built up slowly, like water filling a glass drop by drop. Every conversation became a silent test. Every sentence I spoke came with doubt. I started to wonder, what was missing? Was it my pronunciation? My accent? Was I too slow? Too formal? Too nervous? I started avoiding conversations that weren't necessary. At grocery stores, I pointed instead of speaking. On calls, I kept my replies short. I would watch people speak English so naturally on YouTube, in interviews, in series like Friends or The Office, and wonder, how do they do that? It wasn't just what they said. It was the way they said it, the comfort in their voice, the rhythm in their speech, the way their words flowed like a song they weren't even thinking about. Meanwhile, I felt like I was dragging my words across broken glass. I knew the rules. I knew the words, but I was still struggling. At one point, I remember sitting in front of the mirror, trying to copy the way English speakers moved their mouths. I tried to mimic their tone, their smile, their pauses, but it felt forced, fake. I was acting, not speaking. I asked myself over and over, why do I still sound unnatural? I began blaming myself. Maybe I wasn't meant to speak English like that. Maybe some people just had the talent and I didn't. I even thought about giving up trying to sound natural. Why chase something that felt so far away? Then something strange happened. I went to a language meetup where people from different countries came together to practice English. I thought I'd finally be in a place where nobody would judge me. But what surprised me was something else. There was a girl there from Italy. Her English was not perfect. She made small grammar mistakes, but everyone loved talking to her. She laughed easily. She listened with her whole face. She told stories, with her hands, her eyes, her heart. And no one paused to correct her. In fact, people leaned in to hear more. I was stunned. Her English wasn't perfect, but it was alive. I realized then that natural speech was not about being flawless. It was about being present, being comfortable, being you. That night I walked home with my thoughts racing. I wasn't just confused, I was curious. What made her speech feel so natural when mine still felt like homework? She wasn't trying to show off her grammar. She was just being. That was the first crack in the wall I had built around myself. For the first time, I began to question my approach. Maybe the problem wasn't my accent or my words. Maybe the problem was my mindset. You see, I was always trying to speak correct English. But natural English? That was something else. It's like trying to dance. If you keep looking at your feet, you'll never move with the music. I was stuck looking at my own feet, my grammar, my tenses, my pronunciation. I wasn't listening to the music of the language. I wasn't dancing. The turning point came a few days later, in the most unexpected place, a coffee shop in the center of town. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I still remember the weather because it matched the way I felt inside, quiet, heavy, uncertain. I had walked into that coffee shop not because I wanted coffee, but because I wanted silence. I had just finished another frustrating English class, the kind where the teacher asks you to read a passage and you read it. But when it's time to talk about it, your mind goes blank. I could never find the right words. And even when I did, my voice didn't sound like the voice I had in my head. I sounded nervous. I sounded fake. And worst of all, I sounded like I didn't belong. The coffee shop smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans. There were yellow lights hanging from the ceiling, soft jazz music playing in the background, and a buzz of quiet conversations all around. I picked a table in the corner, close to the window, and ordered a hot latte I barely tasted. I wasn't really listening to anything until I heard two voices from the table behind me. Two women, maybe in their late 20s, laughing and talking in English. At first I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but their voices weren't loud. They were light and full of rhythm, like water running over stones. One of them had a slight accent, the other didn't. But both of them sounded free. They weren't trying to impress each other with big words or perfect grammar. They talked about their day, their shoes, a weird dream one of them had, and a funny thing that happened at work. But every sentence they said felt alive. I realized something strange as I kept listening. I could understand everything, not because they were speaking slowly or using simple words, but because they were speaking naturally. They used their hands when they talked. They changed their tone. They laughed in the middle of a sentence. They interrupted each other. It wasn't textbook English. It was real English. It was life in a language. For a long time I thought that speaking English meant being correct. I had worked so hard to memorize grammar rules. I would write down lists of vocabulary and force myself to use them in practice. But I always sounded like I was reading from a script. I was afraid to make mistakes. I was afraid of silence. I was afraid that people would think I was dumb if I said something wrong. And so, I ended up saying nothing at all. But here were two people who were doing the complete opposite. They weren't careful. They were comfortable. They didn't stop to think about the rules. They didn't apologize for their pronunciation. They didn't even look like they were trying to speak English. They were just speaking, like breathing, like laughing, like being. That moment I felt a strange pull inside me. I wasn't jealous. I was inspired. I saw for the first time that English didn't have to be a struggle. It didn't have to be a test. It could be something soft, something human, something that flowed from you, not something you pushed out of your mouth. I started thinking, maybe the problem wasn't that I didn't know English. Maybe the problem was that I never let myself feel it. I had always approached it like a subject in school. But what if I treated it like a friend? What if I stopped trying to be right and started trying to be real? I stayed in that coffee shop for almost 2 hours, pretending to read a book, but really just listening to them. Every time they laughed, I smiled. Every time they used a word, I knew, I felt proud. And every time they made a little mistake, I realized nobody cared. It didn't stop their conversation. It didn't stop their connection. The world didn't fall apart. By the time I left the shop, something had shifted in me. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of my transformation. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know how I would change the way I spoke. But I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to be a student of English anymore. I wanted to be in English. I wanted to speak it the way I breathed, freely, naturally, and without fear. I stopped thinking of English as a foreign language. I started thinking of it as a second home, a place I could decorate with my own voice, my own style, my own way of expressing myself, even if it wasn't perfect. And that decision, that small decision in a cozy coffee shop on a rainy day, is what led me to change everything about the way I used English in my life. The hardest part wasn't learning vocabulary or understanding grammar. It was learning how to live in English. I had spent years thinking that if I could master all the rules and sound as perfect as possible, I would finally speak English naturally. But the truth is, that's not how natural language works. You can't control it. It flows from the heart, and I hadn't been letting myself live in the language. I had been trying to perfect it, to fit it into a mold that wasn't meant for me. One of the most important turning points for me happened when I stopped seeing English as something I needed to perfect and started thinking of it as something I wanted to live in. It was like stepping into a different world, a world where language wasn't something you study, but something you breathe in. I realized that to speak English naturally, I needed to immerse myself in it. But I didn't want to just learn it. I wanted to experience it. I wanted to speak it the way people live it, the way they think it, the way they feel it. I began watching shows, not with subtitles, but with full attention. I didn't just watch to hear the words, but to listen, to the rhythm of the conversation, to the pauses, to the little laughs and the changes in tone. I wanted to hear how people interacted, not just how they spoke. Sometimes I didn't even care about the plot as much as I cared about how the characters felt when they said things. When they argued, I noticed the sharpness in their voices. When they laughed, I felt the warmth. I wanted to understand that feeling, not just the literal meaning of the words. In one particular show, I watched a scene where a character was deeply frustrated with the situation. Instead of focusing on the exact words they were saying, I tried to connect with the emotion behind the words. How did their voice crack when they were upset? How did their sentences stumble over the weight of the emotion? I realized that in those moments, The exact grammar wasn't as important as how those words were felt and expressed. It was about the human connection behind the language. I didn't repeat the words the way I used to, trying to mimic them perfectly. Instead, I began to copy the emotions, the way they made me feel. Sometimes I'd stand in front of the mirror and say simple sentences, but I wouldn't focus on how perfectly I said each word. I would focus on whether the sentence felt right. Did it feel natural? Did it feel like I belonged in that moment? If I felt that connection, then I knew I was getting closer. But there was more. I wanted to be more than just a passive learner. I knew that if I wanted to speak naturally, I had to live the language. So I began joining online calls with people who didn't care about my grammar. They cared about the conversation. I joined groups where English wasn't just about sounding perfect, but about connecting. The topics didn't matter much at first, whether it was about movies, books, or just daily life, but the way we connected through our words, the way we shared our thoughts, was what made the experience powerful. I found myself forgetting that I was practicing English at all. The more I let go of trying to get it right, the more natural my speech became. I didn't worry about every mistake, every mispronunciation, or every moment when I couldn't think of the right word. It didn't matter. The people I was talking to weren't judging me. They were just listening and responding. And that's when I realized something huge. English wasn't a test. It was a tool for connection, a bridge between people, a way to express myself and hear others. The more I thought of it as a tool for communication, rather than as something to perfect, the more natural it became. I also started listening to music in English, just for the fun of it. At first, I would try to catch every word, thinking I had to understand it all. But soon I realized that I didn't need to understand every word. I could just listen to the rhythm of the music and the emotions it carried. There were times when I didn't understand the words at all, but I still felt the story of the song, and that was okay. The important thing wasn't the grammar, the perfect pronunciation, or even the meaning of every word. It was about letting the language flow through me, letting it take over without forcing it into a box. There's a certain freedom in not being so focused on perfection. I didn't correct myself every second anymore. I didn't obsess over whether I had said he don't instead of he doesn't. I let the conversation happen naturally, letting the words come when they came, without holding back. Slowly but surely I started to feel different. My English was becoming more than just a set of rules I'd memorized. It was becoming part of me, part of how I expressed myself to the world. The turning point came when I went to a friend's birthday party. We were chatting about the usual things: work, movies, and life. As I spoke, I realized that I wasn't thinking about the words or the grammar anymore. I was just speaking. I was in the conversation, not outside it, worrying about how to make every sentence perfect. And when I stopped thinking about English and just lived it, that's when something shifted. No one asked, "Where are you from?" No one commented on my accent or my word choice. Instead, they said, "You speak so naturally." That was the moment I realized how far I had come. It wasn't about learning all the grammar rules or trying to sound like a native speaker. It was about trusting myself, trusting that I could express my ideas and feelings without worrying about every single word. And the more I lived in English, the more it became a part of who I was. It had been a long day, the kind of day where you feel like everything you've been working toward is finally starting to come together, but you don't yet realize how important that one small moment will be. I had spent the entire evening reflecting on my journey, tracing the small victories and struggles that led me to this point. Learning to speak English naturally wasn't just about memorizing words or phrases, or even knowing how to structure a sentence. It was about understanding how to exist in the language, how to feel comfortable with it, how to live it. That night, as I sat on my bed, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of my bedside lamp, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my friend Sophie in Canada. She and I had been friends for a while, but we'd only spoken a handful of times. We had met online through a shared interest in photography, and over time, our conversations had grown into something more meaningful, an exchange of ideas, life updates, and laughs. "Hey, how about a call tonight?" the message read. "I miss hearing your voice." I smiled. Sophie was one of the first people I'd met who didn't mind my imperfections when speaking English. She never corrected me. She always just listened. And that's when I realized how different this friendship had become from all the others. We weren't just two people speaking a language to communicate. We were two souls connecting in a way that transcended the boundaries of grammar, pronunciation, or even vocabulary. I glanced at the clock. It was 9:30 p.m., a perfect time to catch up. I took a deep breath and dialed her number. The phone rang, and I felt a slight flutter in my chest. It wasn't nerves exactly, but a mix of excitement and a little anticipation. Every time we spoke, I could feel my confidence growing, but tonight, it felt different. I had just finished reflecting on my journey with the language, on how I had pushed myself, struggled, and finally started speaking without thinking too much. I was curious to see if this call would feel the same. "Hello?" Sophie's voice crackled through the speaker, full of warmth. "Hey," I said, grinning. "How's it going?" "It's going great," she replied. "I've been looking forward to this call all day." We spent the first few minutes catching up, talking about our families, our plans, and the things we were passionate about. Sophie asked about my photography, and I told her about a project I was working on for a local art gallery. She was excited to hear about it, and I could feel her genuine enthusiasm. As the conversation flowed, we shifted topics to our personal lives, sharing funny stories and serious thoughts. We laughed a lot, like we always did, but something was different. We didn't talk about English. We didn't discuss how to say this word or that sentence. We were just talking. The conversation felt so natural, so effortless. I was so caught up in our exchange that I didn't even realize how much time had passed. The minutes slipped by unnoticed. We spoke about our childhood, memories, our dreams, and the challenges we'd both faced over the years. It was the kind of deep conversation that only happens when you're comfortable with someone, when you feel at ease enough to open up. I didn't worry about my accent, the occasional word I didn't know, or whether I was speaking too slowly or too quickly. I wasn't thinking about how I was speaking. I was just living in the conversation, in the moment. It was a feeling of freedom. Freedom from the constant self-monitoring, from the fear of making mistakes. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about connection. I didn't need to worry about how I sounded. All that mattered was that Sophie understood me, and I understood her. We were communicating in a way that went beyond words, in a way that was fluid and genuine. As I sat there in my room staring at the phone in my hand, I felt a rush of pride. I had done it. I had learned to speak English in the most natural way possible, not because I had studied for hours or memorized vocabulary lists, but because I had stopped trying to force it. I had let the language become a part of my life, a part of my expression, and as a result, it became effortless. It wasn't just a milestone in my language learning journey. It was a shift in my mindset. I had stopped focusing on the language itself and started focusing on the experiences I wanted to share, the emotions I wanted to convey, and the stories I wanted to tell. That was the key to speaking any language naturally, focusing on the meaning behind the words, not the words themselves. I smiled to myself, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over me. The road had been long, and there were times when I doubted myself, when I thought I would never get to this point. But now, in this moment, I realized that it had all been worth it. The struggles, the mistakes, the uncomfortable moments, it had all led to this, and I knew that I could continue to grow, to learn, and to speak English naturally, not just for myself, but for all the connections I would make along the way. So that was the day I knew I had made it. I had learned to speak English naturally, not as a task or a challenge, but as an integral part of who I am. If you've ever struggled with speaking English, or if you're still trying to find that natural flow, I want to tell you, it's possible. Don't stress about perfection. Let the language become a part of you. Keep practicing, keep connecting with others, and soon you'll find yourself speaking naturally, just like I did. If you enjoyed my story and want more tips on how to speak English naturally, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to English Tone.